healthful place of refuge and its strategic importance in the Atlantic world. And this comes into play in World Wars I and II, which was another area that I felt we didn't have a lot of concrete information on what went on there.
Marie, I'm so sorry. I have to interrupt you. Your microphone's not working, so I'm going to get you to switch. It's because I have this one turned on. Okay. Yeah. Oh, so I don't know what happened, but yours isn't working.
Oh no. So all the Zoomers don't have an introduction.
No. Oh.
I think I got it. Oops, I almost got it. I have to say it has been a week of tech nightmares.
Okay. Sorry.
So, it fits that things wouldn't work. So I grabbed these two pictures, and I will say I took them both from the Nova Scotia Museum because it's hard to find pictures of the Boutelier family, except for in Jill Martin's Sable Island in black and white, which is a gorgeous book. But Boutelier is such an interesting character, and his correspondence, once he came under the federal government, really dove into a few of his preoccupations about life and some really detailed descriptions. He was the superintendent from 1884 till 1912, so a very long span that he was there. And shortly after the federal assumption of responsibility, which didn't happen right away, but as administration moved into place, in 1890, he submitted a census and inventory of the island, outlining the material and the human side of the humane establishment. There were the buildings of the main station, where he as superintendent lived, outpost stations 1 to 4, and the two lights, the West Light, or Station 5 at that time, and the East, or Station 6. There were buildings, there were outbuildings, there were equipment for life-saving and for farming, supplies, livestock. So there were 47 human residents, 6 families and 10 assistants. And there were also 91 head of cattle, 36 working horses, 2 stock stallions, and 400 wild ponies, or the wild horses. So that was Sable Island in 1890. He wrote a great deal about ways to improve the efficiency of the life-saving service and to keep things in order. And one of the things that he sent was in 1895, this map which outlined the island, which is interesting. Just the ecologist was very interested to see this, the shape of the island in 1895, and the work of each patroller, because the life-saving service conducted regular horseback patrols daily whenever they could see. So he was showing the distance between the stations each patroller had to travel to emphasize his argument that he didn't have enough staff and they had too much patrolling to do. In this, he also wrote about the reviving, what did he call it? He had a really great, but it was a reviving drink that they carried with them, which was a bottle of cow's milk, fresh cow's milk, because everybody had a certain amount of cattle at their station. And then a solution to add to it, which had ammonium and capsicum, or the hot element in pepper, and ginger. And it was to revive or something any victims that they should happen to encounter. And if they did not encounter a victim, then they would just drink the milk and ride back home. But this story, this description, which he sent to the Marine agent then gave to the Halifax paper to share the very methodical scientific work of the lifesavers on the island. And it is also upside down. In case you're familiar with the island, it has north at the bottom rather than the top. But as well as the life-saving work, there was an unending round of basically farming on the island. Every one of the stations had a small farm, and they also harvested cranberries. The cranberry harvest was another element of how, throughout the 19th century, the service essentially paid a very large amount of its own costs. It did receive an annual sum from the British Board of Trade, but it also had a cranberry harvest that they exported. And in 1901, the assistant deputy minister wrote about Boutilier and his work, or Boutilier. I struggle with how his name is pronounced. But he said, by unceasing work and intelligent attention to all of his duties, the superintendent manages to save quite a considerable amount of money by supplying most of the food from the livestock, the vegetables raised on the island. And it will be remembered that the cranberry crop, which is almost every year successful, has fetched over $700, and the gathering, choosing, and barreling of the cranberries entails considerable skill and work. And this is all done without extra pay. So the lifesavers did receive pay, but they also earned money to operate the island, as well as the men. Each life-saving station was generally occupied by a family, and it was really the families who were engaged in the work of the island as assistants, as cooks, as farmhands. In 1910, Mrs. Susan Kelly recounted her story of life on the island to a newspaper, arguing that she should have compensation because she had served for 20 years with her husband at one of the stations on the island. He was paid, she was not paid, but she took over the patrol whenever he could not do it, up to 2 weeks at a time. And she also worked in the house. She recounted the story of the 1869 Saxby Gale, which, if anyone's familiar, was a very back when severe storm events were once a century. It was the storm of that century. It was a hurricane that combined with a full moon tide at high tide and created enormous floods. And she wrote that she had crawled to the collapsing stable to set the horses free. She readied the lifeboat and she was cutting holes in her house floor to allow the incoming water to flow through. But when her husband was no longer able to work, they were then sent off the island and she had no compensation. And it was taken up by the deputy minister, and a lawyer in Halifax also supported her case. Another family member doing work for not quite for free was Trixie Boutilier, who was on the horse at the beginning. She's Boutilier's daughter, and she spent much of her young life on the island and took a lot of photographs. She also was a very early informal employee of the Meteorological Service of Canada, because her father, as superintendent, was tasked by the service at the end of the 19th century with taking reports for the service, but he didn't have time to do it. So he taught Trixie how to do it, and she did it for him, and then he shared the pay with her. Another large aspect of life on the island, because it's families with children, was education. And this was something I was curious about because I'd hear references to it, but I really wasn't sure how it worked. And I sort of learned that work is kind of a generous description of what went on. Boutilier himself initially sent his children off island to go to school, which was also an issue because the department employed the fathers, employed the men, and so provided things for the men, and they accepted that families were on the island. But initially, they didn't even want to pay the transport. They actually, on occasion, charged people transport for their family members to come to and from the island. But he sent his children off island for school, but the operators of the station had to apply to the Department of Marine for permission to hire a teacher to provide an education. So the employees paid the teachers, but the department did agree to provide the board and transport for the teachers. Arthur Tobin, the keeper of the East Light, wrote to Boutilier, I have 5 children between the ages of 3 and 14 who have received no education. I'd like to know if I could have the privilege of getting a private tutor for 1 year. And John Donaldson, the keeper at number 3, also requested a teacher who he would pay the salary for her himself. He wrote as well as having 4 children between 6 and 16, his wife was not very strong and finds it very lonely at our station and wishes to have a young woman teacher come and stay. So the weight of life on the island for some people as well is something that emerges in some of these letters. So in 1900 again, Boutilier again was writing to the agent that people would like to keep the teacher that the lighthouse keeper had hired, be able to keep her on. So what they did is that they agreed all together. One of the stations by then, number 2, had been shut down, and they agreed that they would fix up the house because it wasn't too bad, the teacher could have it, and the school would be located there. So in all of this, I was just very interested that in fact, even though the island is in between the federal and the provincial in terms of jurisdiction, it's the people on the island themselves that are making every bit of effort to make sure that there's education for the kids on the island. And given that that was the issue with education, healthcare immediately also pops to mind as how people on the island, who on the one hand are present to save the lives of anybody endangered in a shipwreck, but how they dealt with their own emergencies when they happened. And it was, again, they had to make all of the effort to get care. So Boutelier wrote that Donaldson's wife had miscarried and she was severely ill, and that they needed someone to come and help. And he also reported that the East Light keeper was ill and confined to his room. And the next year, they had a girl travel to the island with sealers who were coming out to seal in the winter. They gave her a girl passage so that she could help take care of sick people on the island. In another case, which was literally a bit striking, Aubrey Northrup of Halifax in 1910, who worked on the island, and he kind of had a skill for irritating people, but he got kicked in the face by a horse, and he lost one eye because of it. And then massive correspondence trying to get some compensation or some consideration for having been injured on the island. And what they did was they gave him another job that he could do. And then they fired him a few years later because he was still very irritating. So it was he was an interesting fellow, though, a lot of correspondence. But you get like very different people, a range of people accepting this kind of work. And in the early 20th century, one of the things that comes through because the government starts keeping more records is that the people coming to work are a little more diverse than you might imagine. And that as well as many Haligonians, and there are lots, and people from the shore, there are people straight from England and straight from Ireland and from Barbados are amongst the people in the early 20th century who are working. And all we have is their names. And we also have the interesting fact that information about origins or racial information begins to be introduced into forms that never had that information before. So you really don't know what's going on in the 19th century. Nobody wrote that down. But in the early 20th, they start to keep a record of that. And I'm doing a little skipping because I think I'm talking a lot. And I don't have a clock on this. 7:25. Okay. So aside from all of the various issues, and I think, oh yeah, I do have some very islandy looking fellows that I got from the Nova Scotia archives that Boutelier also wrote far more than anyone else did, but he wrote some good accounts of struggling to keep order in his idea of order on the island. And he reported one frustrating encounter in 1893, because on the one hand, it is their job, theoretically, it is their job to salvage vessels, and they do take it seriously, but there's always temptation as well. So he wrote of an irritating incident when he visited number 2. So this was earlier on, kept by William Osborne, and found 2 looking glasses which had been removed from the stateroom of a vessel that they were in the process of trying to save. Osborne was quite insolent in his manner, Boutelier wrote, and when I ordered him not to use the telephone, they had a telephone at that time that was just on island that went between the various stations. Except to report to me, he informed me he would do as he damned pleased, and did, after I left, notify number 3 of my visit. So he was telling his buddy to hide the stuff that he took home. In 1895, the keeper of the East Light reported dories with local fishermen at the wreck of the Nerito, and the keeper sent a man from number 4 to warn them off, but when they left, they took 2 dory loads of materials from the wreck, including apparently blocks and some tackles, and they injured the engine room skylights. And this would become something that became more embarrassing for the humane establishment, trying to keep ships in good condition for the insurers who were more likely to come and operate the salvage themselves later on. While life and work on Sable Island were difficult, there were also certain expectations of the quality of the men in service, and Boutelier demanded obedience and ability to get along with island society. In 1896, he sent off a man who he found insolent and supported his decision with the observation that he was not popular with his comrades and made himself disagreeable in the men's house by tale-bearing and telling lies and making mischief. In 1897, he reported having sent a man off because he was not adapted to the isolated life and got at times a little demented, which is a risk one runs. He also reported this man was unsuitable as he did not wish to serve where the superintendent wished to send him, explaining, "I must have men who will go where they're sent and do the best they can," which I just think is universal. But in the early 20th century, so that we start seeing the whole thing becomes by 1910 into the 1920s, also the authority to staff moves away from Boutelier and the Marine agent and being very local to becoming something that is more part of the federal government and more administrative. But there's another side to the employment or choosing of employees for the island that spoke to sort of Nova Scotia's perceptions of the island and life on the island as well. That it would be a place where someone could go clean up. So it was people who needed to be removed from the temptations of alcohol because it was forbidden on the island that no one was to have alcohol. There was an account that a barrel of rum washed up and it was sworn that it was disposed of. And but it did, there was always a danger of alcohol amongst the salvage, but it was the rule that there was to be no alcohol. So in 1900, a local businessman wrote to the MP to ask if his cousin, who was a victim of the power of alcohol and a burden to his wife and family, having ruined his business through his excesses, could come to the island. He was brought without pay initially and then added to the staff at the request of the businessman who was the friend of the MP. And that was accepted, and Boutelier said he was working well. But then a year later, a request came from a Professor Murray of Dalhousie University for his cousin. I don't know if anybody knows these people, but through the MP, asking if he could come again because of alcoholism, and Boutelier resisted. He said, "The experiments made heretofore in that direction have been fraught with evil, and the little population of 46 officials and their family have united in protesting against further experiments of the kind as being hurtful." But they didn't stop. The requests continued in 1903. A petition from the Nova Scotia Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to the Minister of the Finance asked for Arthur Marshall to be allowed to go to the island and work for his board because he needed to, again, he needed it as a break from, to get away from alcohol, basically, or to be distanced from alcohol. But again, Boutelier described in another one that, although it had been helpful to the men and that they did not get any drink on the island, but their intense sufferings have had a most depressing effect on the men with whom they work. Life on the island is not very cheerful at best, and I think we should not willingly add to its hardships. But they kept coming, the requests. And I'm trying to think, there's a truly good one in which in 1914, a Halifax businessman wrote to the Conservative minister, having vetted his request already through the patronage committee. I was really intrigued how this works. For a faithful party friend who's lost a grip on himself through liquor. So this belief in the power of Sable Island to heal, as well as from addiction, also included health. And that there were requests, there was another request for Edgar Shand, the son of James Shand, auctioneer, to come to the island, not a drinking man at all, but it was hoped that a change from Halifax to the island would be a great benefit to him, which I found very curious. And then another family, it was requested if the father could have a job on the island, it would benefit the entire family inclined to consumption and delicate to be on the island, as had been said that a carpenter who had come previously with his family, they had all benefited marvelously in their health while there. I am not prepared to argue with that conclusion, but I found it an interesting one. The interest in employment on the island also extended to simply people who felt that they had a connection or a right to have a job on the island. So in 1900, the MP Russell received a petition from his community objecting to the promotion of a Mr. Soderberg and requesting that a Mr. McNabb be given the job as head of one of the stations on the island. Petitioners alleged that Soderberg and his wife were not naturalized citizens of this country and could barely speak a word of English, and claimed that Liberal supporters should have the post, threatening the MP with election defeat if he did not help them in this matter. The minister forwarded the petition to Boutelier, but Boutelier said that Soderberg was good and could speak English and was going to keep his job. And he also argued that it was important to promote people from within the service whenever possible, as bringing men above the heads of capable men on the island would not only be unjust, but would be demoralizing to the service. But that with all of this concern about jobs and who got jobs and who got to have jobs, the requests for higher pay and the petitions for higher pay throughout this whole period are absolutely endless. It is a very it was a very constant concern that the island, for all of the hardship and the isolation, that the pay did not compensate them, especially when they also had to pay for things like school teachers and travel for healthcare. But as well as the salvage work, the reality of life on the island was that people also dealt with victims of shipwrecks on a fairly regular basis. In 1893, two bodies washed ashore and were buried in the graveyard at Number 4 Station. In 1895, the body of a French fisherman identified by his sabots, wooden shoes, was found, and he was buried at the main station. Our archaeologist is just interested whenever I can find reference to a burial. But as well, in 1896, the life-saving crew rescued the entire crew of the bark Raphael D of Genoa. And the ship was breaking up on the shore in a fog, and they were able to use their rocket and breeches buoy, which I should have a picture of, I don't, but it's their best equipment. So with the rocket, they would fire a rope to attach to the rail of a ship, and then the breeches buoy, it has a bungee cord kind of feel about it, but it is like a buoy, a lifesaver with something that holds a person in place so people can be transferred ship to shore over rough seas. And so this was a very successful rescue. And again, the agent reported it to the newspaper and shared it to show the service of the life-saving service, but it was also noted that they did not need the lifeboats themselves. And there are a considerable number of lifeboats on the island, which were a question because they were getting kind of out of date. But as well as that, between the wrecking and the salvage and the rescue, there was a wreck at the end of the 19th century, the Bourgogne, a French vessel, which was a passenger vessel with a large number of people on board, that was kind of like the Francis a century before, was a vessel that the Duke of Kent's household was on board. He was not on board, but many wealthy people, it got a lot of attention. That was the beginning of the life-saving service. And the Bourgogne, the end of the 19th century, got international attention once again. There was a lot of newspaper coverage about the wreck, and many well-known people knew people on the wreck, and there were no victims saved at all from that wreck. So that was famous, and at the same time, a dark moment for the island. It made the island famous, not because of a brave rescue, because it was impossible that time. And amongst the people drawn to that were Alexander Graham Bell and his wife, Mabel Hubbard Bell, who came because they knew people who had been lost in that. And I think they were hoping for some kind of closure, but it created an interesting relationship between themselves and the island, including that they requested permission to buy ponies. So they took two ponies, or they had two ponies shipped to Cape Breton. And their coming and going also showed how someone could get permission to visit the island if they weren't part of the service, and how someone could get permission to buy a pony if they weren't connected to the service or the marine fishery. Interestingly, the men in the service often requested to be allowed to buy ponies when they were leaving, which was an interesting connection to the island. So I just have to throw in a few more horses every once in a while. As well as the salvage and all of the various concerns about the island, another kind of relationship with the island that definitely came into place just with the federal public service was the ecological interest in the island, the management of ecology. The Central Experimental Farm from the very start was curious about, came to study, was interested in the island, was interested in vegetation management. They introduced trying to plant a number of different types of grass. The natural marram grass, as far as I can tell, is the winner. But amongst the grasses that they introduced, with the help of the British High Commission and some very beautifully written, very florid letters about the wonders of tussock seed, grass seed from the Falkland Islands. This grass was brought from the governor of the Falkland Islands, was given to Boudelier. They were given instructions on how to plant it. It did not take. They also tried alfalfa, and they were pleased with ownless brome grass. But there were a number of experiments with grass, and there were also reports of pests. There was a plague of locusts one year that they were very upset about, and the scientist from the experimental farm who was involved proposed different ways to deal with the locusts. So it was something that drew attention and received study throughout the period of the humane establishment from the 1890s forward, and we're still around. But I'm going to grab a bit of water. I'm not a prize-winning picture taker. I know others are much better. But after 1905, life and work on the island begins to evolve considerably. And I'm not going to blame Thomas Rattle personally for that, but it was in 1905, the beginning of the Marconi service that came to the island. And when I was looking at these records, part of the reason I was because I was completely baffled with how the Marconi service fit with the island. How did the pieces work together? And so I can report that I kind of figured it out. Whether or not everybody here was baffled about that question, I think it is a very interesting one. So at the very, very beginning of the transatlantic service, the Marconi service, there was a service established on Sable Island and a related service established at Camperdown outside of Halifax, which I'm not 100% certain where that is. It's not the little village of Camperdown on the South Shore. It's a different place that was called Camperdown. And through this period, the establishment for the Marconi service was usually 3 or 4 male operators. They didn't seem to bring families with them pretty much ever. But at the same time, a new superintendent came in, Blakeney, and when he began, he was informed that his job would be 2/3 life-saving and 1/3 supporting the meteorological service in relation to the first-class telegraph station. So the meteorological service and the telegraph station were seen as one thing at that time. And just to justify my own stance on this, in fact, there was enough confusion that there were letters written to the Marine agent to explain to him that he was the boss of everyone on the island, because he wasn't clear on that. So there was definitely confusion over who was in charge of what. So the private service of the Marconi operated on the federal island through an agreement where the government provided free transport to the island and use of the island, and the Marconi service provided the government with free telegraph services at the same time. So it was kind of a trade issue. But in 1914, this changed because of World War I and the strategic importance of having a good telegraph service near the naval station at Halifax, a good telegraph base so that the naval station could communicate. So the service, the sort of the meteorological service side of it was transferred to the Department of Naval Service briefly in 1914. Just enough time for a naval officer to come and give a highly critical review of the Sable Island service. He concluded that Sable Island was gradually becoming a farm and that life saving was being given a secondary position. He also he offered considerable recommendations for improving the service, including getting rid of the farming. But then it was transferred back to the Department of Marine and the Lighthouse Service. But this view of the value of the farming was also echoed by the Marconi operators, who, when they learned that it was considered to be part of their pay and supply was to get food from the farms, they were unimpressed and they held out they wanted a regular supply. They wanted groceries. They didn't want farm produce. And so that had to be worked out. And it was the beginning of a discomfort that was quite interesting in between the services of the life-saving service, the superintendent attempting to exercise authority, and the Marconi operators, who were a different group of people, young men with some education, who, amongst other things, being directed by the Naval Service, were not forbidden to have alcohol. And this was definitely became a source of tension between, including at times, the island people were forbidden to visit the Marconi people because of the alcohol question. So with that little bit of discomfort, nonetheless, the service that became established on the island became increasingly important. And so after World War II, during World War II, the government moved to buy the entire service away from Marconi because they wanted to make improvements to the service that Marconi was not willing to spend money on. So they bought the service away from Marconi, so it became a federal government service under transport, although it was still Marconi operators until 1935, after which it became completely federal. That's me answering a question for myself. So, but as the strategic importance of the communication service on the island grew in the same time period, the importance, especially the interwar period, the importance of the life-saving service itself was more and more challenged. And this also became a point of stress between Marconi and the life-saving service, because when they required labor, when it was a private service, they would hire the life-saving service people to do labor for them. When it became a government service, then they were not willing to pay the life-saving service to do work. And then suddenly there were no life-saving service people available to do any work for Marconi. So that became another sort of source of stress between the two operations. And in this time, already number 2 station had been shut down. And in fact, when the superintendent at the time wrote a long argument for why he needed more people for the life-saving service, the response of the Marine and Fisheries Department was to shut down station number 4 in 1927. So the number of life-saving stations is contracting, while at the same time, a request had been made from the American Steamship Service, actually contacted the Canadian government, requesting that Canada install an automated beacon to facilitate navigation for ships with radio compasses. So the position of Sable Island, as shipping has changed and the needs of shipping have changed, but the potential for communication has grown, Sable has a different function, but continues to have an important international function in this time period. And at the same time, being the federal government, not that I don't love the federal government, we are always awesome, but there's always that desire to get more for less that is continuous, so that the radio service increased, but the number of radio operators actually decreased in this period. And at the same time, the humane establishment also was decreasing. And in the 1920s, an agent's report again complained about a decline in the quality of staff and poor conditions. And So at this time in 1936, the last outer station number 3 was closed. And a memo from the superintendent of lights reported that there was no further need for lifeboats, as none had been used in a rescue for approximately 30 years. And the author of that letter, J.J. McLean, who was with the radio service, advocated leaving supplies at houses of refuge and lighthouses and having a staff of 3 for each lighthouse, but nothing further. In 1936, as this was being reported by the radio service, the main station, there was a family of 8, Superintendent Faulkner at this time, wife and 6 children, laborers, so a total of 17, but 7 of those are wife and 6 children, a family of 8 at the West Light, a family of 3 and 2 laborers at number 3, which was then closed at that time, 3 people at the East Light, so 33, that was going to go down to 29 immediately, and then 4 with the radio services. So the island is steadily declining, the number of people on the island. But this is the interwar period, and World War II brought some significant changes to the island, which was all, this was something that I was quite curious about. I had personal accounts from Superintendent Johnson, but I didn't really have a sense of how the station at Sable Island, how it came to be and how it functioned and what happened to it, just small questions. So by then, that radio beacon that had been requested was in fact what was struck by a Lockheed Hudson airplane on June 3rd, 1941. So the first wartime incident was a plane that was flying over Sable Island in poor conditions, struck one of the radio towers. And the communications about this crash, consistently, 5 people were killed in this crash, but the condition of the radio beacon is reported in each telegram as well, and what they're doing. And they're acting as quickly to save the radio beacon as they are to see what's happened to the victims of the air crash, which is partially a sign of, however one might take it, the importance of that radio beacon. So the report that came at the end of the day, mast bent double at second stave from top, also 90 degrees bend between 2 top staves. Mast is broken and at this point, but not right. 5 bodies brought ashore. Airplane struck South Mast, Sable Island at 10:40 a.m. today and crashed in the ocean. Beacon transmitter off air for short period, resumed operation with temporary aerial. Which is, I have to say, it's a wartime, but a striking view that these 2 things, the loss of life and the loss of the signal, are put in that order. At this time, Johnson is still superintendent, and he and his men rescue, they're the ones who find the bodies of the 5 victims of the air crash, which one can only imagine was a fairly horrifying task for that group of people to undertake. And then after that, shortly after that, there was another major wreck of the SS Independence Hall, a merchant ship out of Philadelphia carrying armaments, traveling in convoy. And sort of the long and short of that major wreck is that it happened at a short distance from the island, but the rescue was handled entirely by naval vessels. The people and the capacity they had on the island, they were not able to help. And that became a tremendous issue. But at the same time, it was also noticed that German U-boats were using the area off Sable Island to fuel. And I would have to understand the operation of U-boats better to understand why anyone would think it would be a good idea to fuel in the area of Sable Island. But it was reported by the Air Service that there were submarines off Sable refueling. And so it was decided to post a military presence on the island. And with that, the superintendent Johnson became Flying Officer D.S. Johnson. He was also chosen based on his experience and capacity, and a new superintendent was brought in. The Eastern Air Command deployed a Walrus aircraft, which we have here, which is a sturdy water landing aircraft that could run patrol and respond to enemy activity in the area. It was decided to build support structures of a permanent nature near the lake, where the plane would land and take off, and 4 Bren guns, I think I have Bren guns, were put in position in semi-permanent positions there, which I would think would be something like a nest. And 2 buildings were built to support this, which the 2 buildings are still standing. And but even as this came into being, the Eastern Air Command had issues with it because the radio capacity on the island was plain language only, no cipher, which was a risk. And one encounter with Sable Island's weather, I do not know why this was a surprise, and they decided against the service. The plane took off from the island, began a patrol, the fog rolled in, and it did not have enough fuel to get to the mainland. And they had, I would say somebody lost a bit of weight there, but managed to land back on the island. And the memo that reported that had a big word "dead" stacked, stamped on it. So that the Eastern Air Command deployment to Sable Island only lasted a year and a half. But it was an interesting moment on the island, and it's fun because on the island there are the remains of a Bren gun carrier, and it was always wondered, did that have to do with the World War II connection? And vaguely, yes. The Bren gun carrier on the island was bought from Army surplus after the war, and it worked for about a week and a half before it became encrusted in sand and then just rested there. So after the war, Johnson returned to his role as superintendent. And I have to say, I have an affection for Johnson because he's on the Boutelier level for liking to write letters about how people are doing and what's going on the island. And he adds an impressive ability to sketch as well. So in this sketch, he is writing an argument for moving the West Light and the main station to the center of the island, to the right of the lake area, which did not in fact happen, but he was a great advocate of trying to improve the operations on the island, and also arguing that the men on the island were good, they just needed support, and that would be what would help them. He also had ideas for how to prevent erosion if he couldn't move the lighthouse. So he proposed that for the West Light, and this is the structure in place. And 2 years later, they moved the West Light further east because the structure, nothing can stop the erosion when it wants to happen. So as we are moving into the post-war era, at this time, it was decided by 1957 that the Humane Establishment Service would shut down in 58, and that the Meteorological Service would take over operations on the island, except for the East Light would remain under aids to navigation. So this is a sketch of the buildings on the island in 1962 when the transfer was complete. So it does give you a sense of the many different operations buildings on the island. And I can back up, this is a list of some of the carpenter shop, powerhouse, barn. There's a lot of that, hen house, warehouse. So it's still a range of between farming and operations buildings on the island in 62. But as this was happening and the service was transferring, it raised a few questions about the future of the other inhabitants of the island, because the horses really had been part of life for the Humane Establishment. Some were trained, some were captured, sometimes what they called excess population were exported, but they were involved with the horses. The Meteorological Service staff really had some concerns about the way they did not see themselves running the whole island, running the ecology as well as running their service. And at the same time, there was a report that a sandstorm had wiped out all the grass on the island and the horses were starving. This report came from the East Light Keeper. So the first thing that came was that the RCAF agreed to do a hay drop so that the horses wouldn't starve. this had happened in the past before, but it was an interesting solution. So they dropped some hay, which in another account I read, the horses would never eat the hay that was dropped for them anyway. But this act of dropping hay caught some public attention. So in the local paper, we have manna from heaven for the horses. And then, while they were working on the problem, it was decided to bring the scientists from the experimental farm who came with a couple of horse dealers to look at possible solutions. And they came up with the idea that all of the horses should be sold. And at that time, they were talking about, well, they couldn't be sold as workhorses because that's not really relevant anymore. Perhaps they could be children's ponies or something. That might be a way to sell the horses. So they were looking at possibly selling the horses, but they had to put them on up for tender. They couldn't just sell them to one person. So as they came up for tender, I think this is the Globe and Mail. And then there's then the Toronto paper takes the Toronto paper direction with the story. It's in papers from New York to Boston to Vancouver. This has caught the imagination all across North America. And somewhere in that process of reporting the tender, the plans, etc., it morphed into they were being sold for dog food. And so then the people got even more interested, and you see children's letters about the subject at this point. And this letter was written directly to Diefenbaker, not to a minister or an agent or anyone like that. So this went straight to Diefenbaker, and it's really interesting in the file on it. Diefenbaker personally took charge of this, and he did also respond to a telegram from the Society for Prevention of Cruelties. And not just the little kids, but there were other lobby groups as well putting pressure. Diefenbaker took this to his cabinet, who were really annoyed because I guess they had a visit with the President of the United States coming up really soon, and he insisted on dealing with it. And so it became an order in council or a cabinet order that the horses would be henceforth protected and could not be sold. And so this still stands as the horses are protected residents. So in that period of transition, as the humane establishment ended and the operation of the island moved in a different direction, it became established that the horses would be protected residents of the island. And so this brought a new era to the island of still very important strategically, important scientifically, and this would grow in research, also resource exploration. And I suspect I had better stop at this point. So I will just leave it with a goodbye from Sable. And that this was as far as I got with this. I was fascinated by the evolution of it's such a small community in a large space. It's 40 kilometers long, so it's spread out but small community, and many ways over the century that people coped with living in isolation, coped with living in a very tiny community where people were interdependent. And you see some very touching examples of people supporting each other and a few examples of people going a little crazy. But it's a fascinating place. So I thank you so much for your attention and welcome any questions.